I always like to have lots of things around me. I think perhaps some of the time I use them as distractions, but I like to think that that's when I'm going through all the thought processes that perhaps a writer needs to go through before they actually commit anything to the screen. Obviously, I will always have a cup of tea or coffee on the go. Lots of different notebooks. This beautiful box that my daughter gave me, which is just so pretty. An old golden syrup tin full of pens, because I really like the golden syrup tin, and because the line on it features in something that I've written. I get inspiration from all kinds of objects, even my little voodoo doll here, who dislikes me intensely and is very unkind to me. But I still have to keep him around. Or maybe he's connected with the writing muse and it's the muse's way of saying, come on, you know. Or maybe inject some devilment into the work. My writing schedule. I like to write very early in the morning. I always get up very early because I like the feeling of peace and my thoughts are very undistracted. So I might even get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning and sit down to write then. I don't write in the evenings, I'm much too tired, but I often sit down, watch the television and find thoughts drift into my mind and I remember them ready for the next day. And of course I always keep a notebook, so if I have a sudden idea in the middle of the night I can scribble it down, although I very rarely can understand what I've written the next morning. Well, I think one of the best stories I've ever read is The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. I absolutely loved the story and was drawn into it straight away. And it was all about the things that happen to very ordinary people when they do something that is a little out of kilter with their ordinary world, and the events that follow, and how hard it is to find your way back into ordinary life when you have let something overtake you in that way. And I think that's inspired all of the short stories I've ever written. For a while I have travelled many a mile, I am tired. Again, they're about ordinary people and the often very small things that happen to ordinary people that tip their life over and out of control. And he always manages to make me smile. There's always a little subtle humour. Sometimes the world looks very bleak in a short story, and a little splash of colour that you get from a little bit of humour, I think, makes all the difference. My most favourite short story that I've written is called No Consequence. And I think I particularly love this one because it's about an ordinary family, and those are my favourite kind to write, and a hidden secret within the family that is discovered by the young son, and he keeps it to himself. Then at the end there's what I think is the best ending I've ever done, where there's a lot of emotion, there's a great deal happening in the hearts of the people in the room, but it's all kept very much under wraps. I wanted to end it there because I wanted the family to live on in the reader's minds and hearts and imaginations, and for the reader to perhaps decide for themselves how the family would have responded. And I think a lot of my favourite short stories that I've read are like that. They leave you with feelings and emotions, and they don't tie up all of the loose ends. My upcoming collection of stories is very typical of the way I write, because all of these stories are about ordinary people to whom something extraordinary is happening. And I've tried to capture these people at the very moment that this thing is happening to them. So I'm taking a snapshot, if you like, of their life at that moment. A lot of short stories are the same. You can't take a whole span of a whole life and put it into a short story. You need a moment in somebody's life, a pivotal moment that will interest the reader and give them something to really think about, because quite often the extraordinary event that's happening to these ordinary people is actually not that outlandish. But when these things happen, they throw our world right off kilter, and we have to try to get the world shifting back onto its axis again. And I like short stories to suggest that the characters may not do that. They may not make it, they may not manage it, but hopefully the reader will care enough to stay with the story and find out if in fact their world settles back down again at the end. You almost can get to know the characters with the dialects that come from backgrounds really different from your own better than you can get to know the ones that are just like you. So I think that's why I always write about people who are nothing like me, and I don't often write about people of my age, and I actually like to write from a male perspective far more than from a female perspective, because I just find it more fascinating and more interesting. How would they think, and how are their thoughts different from how a woman would think? And it makes me think more deeply and use my imagination a lot more. I like to have horrible things happening to nice characters. I think that's a good way of writing. I think of the obvious way in which a character might react and discard that, and then I think of the next thing they might do, and I'll probably discard that as well until I've gone through about 10 different possibilities of how they might react, because each one you get to is a little bit more far-fetched and a little bit more amazing, and then you have to be careful that it isn't too far-fetched, of course, and a couple of my stories have ended up being a little bit surreal because I've gone too far that way, and some people have liked it and some people haven't. I once went to a talk by Meg Rossoff, the author, and she said when you're writing you should allow your imagination to go to the very edge of your experience, which is the opposite of writing what you know. A lot of writing advice says write about what you know, and she said almost to do the opposite and go further than that, much, much further, because if it's unpredictable and a bit different, you'll capture the reader's attention more. But again, you have to draw the line between that and being much too out there and much too far-fetched for the reader to believe that what's happening is actually credible. So it's a fine line that you tread. When I write, I do quite a complete first draft. I'm not somebody that can just leave the parts that I know have mistakes in them or that haven't really quite come off the way I wanted them to. I keep going back and making corrections as I work through the story, until I get to the point where I think it would be better to have some time away, some distance from it, and then I put it away for several days in the case of a short story. It might be longer if I've written a novel, but several days for a short story, and then I return to it and I read it out loud, and I think that really shows you where it falters, because if you falter when you read it out loud, the chances are the reader of that story will also have trouble with that particular sentence or that particular paragraph. And then, after I've looked at it all, I'll put it away again for a little while, and then have a third look at it and make any more corrections, particularly looking at how it begins and ends at that stage, because I think by then I've developed enough distance from the story to understand how it should open to attract the reader's attention and interest, and then how it should end properly to leave the reader satisfied, not necessarily knowing everything that there is to know, but satisfied that the story has reached its proper conclusion. I know when to admit defeat, know when to say goodbye. When I start writing, I never know how the story is going to end, and the reason for that is that all my stories are character driven. And it's not until I get to know the characters in the story that I understand what makes them tick, why they're going through whatever it is, and therefore what the outcome is going to be. So I always wait until I get to know them, and then eventually that moment will come, a wonderful moment, when I think, I know how it's going to happen. And sometimes overnight I might change my mind and go back and think, no, actually it's going to happen this way. But always I try to make it the character who tells me how the ending is going to be. And you never really know for sure when it's finished. You just have to trust your own instincts as a writer and know that there is no more work to be done, and then you can say the end.